So good afternoon again, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I've seen that most of you that are joining us have, and so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, Dean Boozang. Great to see you today. So again, to all of you that are joining us, we're so excited that you took time out of your busy day to be part of today's conversation. I took a chance and scanned the attendee list, and it's so great to see familiar faces. Many of you I've had the pleasure of seeing on the road when we used to be able to travel, and I hope that at one point we'll have the opportunity to see you all in person again. I am coming to you live actually from Seton Hall Law School. I'm in my office. Our students are here. We are on ground in a sort of hybrid form of classes, as I think many of you are as well. So it's a great privilege to be able to come on campus and interact with students, although socially distanced, and see their and hear about their experiences. So today's conversation, what we hope to do is give you some insights on Seton Hall. Some of you know that this is the time of year that we would be traveling across the country and meeting with each of you and your students individually. And since we couldn't do that, we wanted to take a few minutes today to share some information with you about the things that make Seton Hall really unique and exciting. And then we wanted to ask Dean Buzang to share some insight, her perspective on the pandemic and how it might be affecting legal education, maybe the legal profession, and then what it might be looking like for our students who are going to head into the job market. But most of all, what we'd like to do is really focus on your questions. So it really is about engagement today. It's about answering maybe the questions and concerns you folks might have. And so we hope that this will be an engaging conversation through your questions. I just want to announce that this is being recorded. A lot of our colleagues couldn't join us today, but wanted to make sure that they were part of this conversation and at least could hear it. And so today's conversation is being recorded. I hope you're all okay with that. And also to let you know that if you're looking to ask a question or want to direct a question to Dean Buzang or myself, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. What we'd like you to use the chat function for is to use it like a conversation. So if you liked something that you heard or agreed with something that Dean Buzang was saying or another peer of yours, to put that in the chat. But then put your questions in the Q&A. That way I know exactly where to look to address your questions. I don't want to miss any questions. I want to make sure that we get that. But having said that, I just want to go ahead and dive into our conversation so that we can get to your questions. I want to take a moment to introduce Dean Kathleen Boozang. She has been a long-standing member of the Seton Hall Law family, and she's coming on board in 1990 as the founder of our now renowned Center for Health and Pharmaceutical Law and Policy. She's also served as Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Vice Provost before taking on the deanship in July 2015. She has had a long and amazing career focused on nonprofit governance issues with a special focus on religiously sponsored hospitals, but has recently expanded her research and teaching these last few years to exploring the legal and policy issues that are related to corporate compliance with a particular focus on the global life sciences industry. I am proud to say that she is a hands-on and present dean, always ready and willing to jump in and help, guide, advise any student, faculty, staff, or alumni. She truly epitomizes our one student at a time philosophy. It's no wonder that the American Society for Health, for Law, Medicine, and Ethics conferred upon her the J. Healy Health Law Teacher Award, and she's also been named Seton Hall University Woman of the Year. Dean Buzang received her JD from Washington University School of Law, where she was inducted into the Order of the Coif and served as the managing editor of Law Quarterly. And she also received her LLM from Yale Law School. Although I'm relatively new to the Seton Hall Law community, I can say that I am truly blessed and privileged to have the opportunity to work for and with and to learn from an amazing leader. Dean Buzang, thank you for joining us today. We're really looking forward to your insight. I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind just opening today's conversation by sharing, again, some thoughts regarding your journey, as well as some thoughts about Seton Hall. You've been here quite some time, so it's truly a special and unique place. Just some thoughts that you want to share with our pre-law advisor about what makes our community truly special and unique.
Thanks so much. So I always worry when somebody describes me as a hands-on dean that that's code for micromanager. So I hope that's not the case. I feel really strongly about working collaboratively so that you can see how everything connects and you're meeting everybody's needs and it's a coherent whole. So my approach to being dean is very much informed by my law school experience. I was first generation and embarrassingly naive about a lot of things. I had never met a lawyer before I went to law school. I don't know if any of you remember Katharine Hepburn, but she was my role model. She and Joyce Davenport from Hill Street Blues, which I hope at least one person remembers either of those actresses. But I feel sorry for myself when I think about some of the things I didn't know when I started law school, and I really didn't know how to navigate the space and felt pretty disadvantaged because I also, from a socioeconomic perspective, both in college and in law school, had fit issues because I didn't have the same kind of resources that others had. So my entire approach to being dean, I call it one student at a time, but it starts with leveling the playing field. And that's an advantage both to those who are first generation, but also to those who have parents who are lawyers, because I've also encountered many situations in which parents are giving their children wrong advice because the world has just changed too much for the parents to be current with some of the opportunities and some of the choices that I think that students are better off making. So one student at a time really acknowledges that we have both a part-time and a full-time program, and that the students come to us with different backgrounds, different pathways. Some have real adult problems. They have families, they have jobs. They're responsible for parents, they're responsible for children. They live in places that are conducive to remote education or the exact opposite. And so I always want to be looking at the world through the lens of where the students are coming from, but then also what their pathways should be. We all know that students can experience detours. They can experience financial crises. They can be disappointed in what they think should be the measure of their success, whereas that's following the crowd, and it needs to be your own goals that you're aspiring to fulfill. And as all of us knows, the smartest person in the class does not necessarily make the best lawyer or the happiest lawyer. The other thing that's obviously different about this generation of lawyers, and it's been true for a while, we've been following the class of 2012 through a variety of studies, is that a large proportion of our graduates will not be in law firms in X number of years. I think it's 5 to 10 years. And so whether it is that they've dropped out of practicing law entirely, which I feel strongly about working with the bar to stave that attrition off, or it's that our graduates are choosing alternative pathways, such as being entrepreneurs, which in the New York metropolitan area is frequently the case, that quickly or immediately students go to work in financial services, for example. We also know that many of our students become privacy officers, corporate compliance officers, vice presidents for HR, and the list goes on. So I try very hard to educate the students about their alternative pathways, especially those students who realize pretty quickly on that practicing law is not for them, but making them realize, understand, and value that their law degree will be a pathway, whether it be to the audit and accounting side of a Big Four, or the consulting side of a Big Four or some other consulting firm, or as I said, one of these alternative pathways for law. So unlike when I went to law school, the law offers many more legitimate and accepted opportunities. And my constant mantra with students is that our aspiration is to not find them a job, it's to launch them into careers where they are going to be fulfilled, both personally and professionally. And they need to partner with us to explore their options, cross a bunch of things off their lists while they're in law school, which I think is easier to do than to necessarily expect that you'll find your passion, which some do, but many don't until after they are out in the world. But they can sure cross a lot of things off and experiment a lot. So I really do believe the entire life cycle needs to be about that student who's sitting in front of you. And then I tell students that we are their partners post-graduation. In the District of New Jersey, for example, the federal district court judges and the Third Circuit do not hire clerks right out of law school. You have to go into a firm or do a state clerkship and then go into a federal clerkship, and then you're going to be looking for a firm again. So we are in our graduates' lives for a long time as they're looking for their first job, their clerkship, their third job, and then maybe thinking about career changes or aspiring to become judges or go into public service. The flip-flop between public service and private practice keeps us engaged with our graduates well into the first decade of their lives. So that is my philosophy. It works for our students. Every student receives my cell phone number during admissions events, and they're very respectful about how they use it. But my goal is to fulfill the students' aspirations and not some aspirations we impose upon them.
Thanks so much, Dean Boozang. And I will be the first to say that you're definitely not a micromanager, but a really great way, a great leader that allows us to grow in our own space. So thank you for that. And thank you for sharing your thoughts on the value propositions at Seton Hall. I know that as I was getting ready for today's conversation, a couple of my pre-law friends really shared some questions, I guess, or maybe some concerns about where we are today as it relates to the pandemic. And how is that really going to affect the legal market? Is it already affecting the legal market? How will it affect outcomes for our graduates? How did it affect the outcomes for our most recent graduates? Is it affecting the classroom experience? So what is this pandemic doing to the legal market, to our legal profession, and to our legal classrooms? And I'm wondering if you can offer some insight on that.
Okay, this is going to be a run-on answer because that was 3 or 4 questions at minimum. So you might need to jog my memory. So let's start with outcomes. Students are spending a lot of money on their legal education, and they and their families need to know there's ROI. As a wholly self-financed student, starting in high school for me, through college and law school, outcomes and ROI has always been very important to me. I lived off federal financial aid for a very long time. And so I pay attention to those. In my opinion, we say one and done. I like all these sayings. So one and done refers to the fact that you should sit for the bar exam once and never again. And obviously with the uniform bar exam that is accepted by, 30 something states now, that is much easier accomplished. And so when I became dean in 2015, I established a task force for a 90% bar pass rate, one and done, 90% the first time, the entire class. And we accomplished that last year. So our students just sat a couple of weeks ago for the bar exam. So the last class that sat, irrespective of where they sat, their first time bar pass rate exceeded 90%. That's actually important to understand. And I'm sure I'm telling you what you already know. but we report to the ABA what the bar pass rate is for our entire class after 2 years post-graduation, which means they can have sat 4 times. What we put on our webpage is first-time bar pass rate. And I know not all schools are doing that. So importantly is to understand what schools are posting with respect to their bar pass rate, whether it's the whole class after 2 years or first-time bar pass rate. So our students just sat in October, and that was the 3rd date that was set for the bar exam. It did impact our employment slightly. So our the slides that you just saw were the class of 2019, 2018 with respect to employment rate. Our class of 2020 employment rate is just above 90% for employment. And that is because there were some firms that kind of paused their process until the students get their bar results, which they won't get until, well, New Jersey has promised December. That's the other thing that's interesting is if you sit in New Jersey, irrespective of where you're going to practice for the UBE, we're one of the earlier states that produces results. So if students are going into New York firms, which a fair number of students come to us to go to New York firms, if they sit in New Jersey, they'll get admitted in New York before a fair number of their colleagues because New Jersey is just quicker, and then they just have to fill out the paperwork and be done with it. So proud of our outcomes, continuing to work and refine and always be better, but we're one of the more successful New York area schools. I think we placed 4th on bar passage rate as among the New York and New Jersey schools. And how's the market? I spend a huge amount of time. One of the things I did was call managing partners of firms to thank them for going forward with their summer programs, which the conversation was really about figuring out what's going on with them from a market perspective and whether they will be hiring. Because of course, most firms across the country, or at least the bigger firms, are not doing on-campus interviewing and 2L summer hires until January because the 2L students have only 1 set of grades so far. So by postponing till January, they'll have 2 sets of grades upon which to make their offers. But in my random calls of firms, they weren't random at all, in my calls to firms to talk about the summer programs and then naturally segue into how the market is. It's amazing the number of firms who have had the best year ever. It's kind of ironic and sad in a certain way, but I've been tracking the New York firms, for example, have been publishing their COVID bonuses, their hazard bonuses, whatever they're calling them. Hazard bonuses are hospitals. I don't know what the COVID bonuses that the large firms are awarding on top of their year-end bonuses. The 2 areas of law that are struggling are commercial real estate and civil litigation, where you need jury trials. A lot of settlements are happening, a lot of mediations are happening. Criminal jury trials are starting. So those are the 2 areas. But otherwise, whether you're talking about insurance, family law, M&A, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the legal market is really hot. And I'm not worried about job placement and feel confident that firms are going forward with their summer programs. And in fact, some of the firms that are supposed to be adhering to the January schedule have been cheating and have already started hiring. So confident about that, feel good about it, wouldn't have admitted as many students as we did this year if we weren't confident about the employment market. That's a moral obligation we have to our students and to our graduates. How has COVID affected the classroom? One of the things that Seton Hall Law was very fortunate about is that because we've been in the graduate market for many years, we went into the graduate degree market pre the 2009 crash. A fair number of schools entered after the crash more recently. But we also have a weekend program, which is for working professionals. It's been hybrid, 1/3 online, 2/3 in person every other weekend. So we've had the conversation for many years about pedagogy, online pedagogy, about hybrid, about remote. And it's not only about pedagogy, but it's also about using effectively having the experience with the technology to produce high quality hybrid and online courses. So we transitioned really well. And I have to say, it won't shock you that faculty were skeptical. Some faculty were skeptical when we went into the world of hybrid and using online education. As a result of the discipline that doing hybrid and best practices in online education has enforced upon us, we are much better teachers. We use formative assessments, so the students get feedback as they're going along, which of course studies show, shockingly, that if you don't cram at the end of the semester for one final, but you learn it and use it as you're going along, you learn it more effectively and you retain it more effectively, which I think explains some of our success on the bar pass rate. Every 1L has a midterm, whether they are weekend or full-time. Usually it was in contracts. We gave those faculty a break and switched to torts this year. So it's been a fascinating thing for us, so that when March 16th, we converted to wholly remote, we did not miss a class. We did have to train some of our adjuncts who had only taught in person. We use fewer adjuncts in the weekend division. But because we were so experienced with and had so many training modules, et cetera, best practices for remote online hybrid education, it was a seamless transition for us. I'm not going to say there weren't bumps, but it was very seamless. And we surveyed the students at the conclusion of the semester, and the feedback we got compared with other entities we compared ourselves with was very strong. And so then we spent the summer knowing we were going to start hybrid, transforming our building to make sure that it was going to be a safe environment, a comfortable environment, and one where the learning experience, whether students are remote or in person, is excellent. And so by the second week of classes, we had the bumps figured out. So, you know, we're in an urban setting. And so we have one classroom where when the trucks go by, the microphones for remote students, those remote students knew every truck that went by. So those kinds of things we smoothed out. And I just came out of a meeting where I said, okay, what are we going to do to ratchet up the experience our students are having in second semester? And so we're installing cameras that the remote students can control so that they can decide when a faculty member is engaged in the Socratic method. Do they keep the camera on the faculty member, on the class, the whole class who are in person, or do they focus in on the student who's speaking? So, you know, every break in the action, we ratchet up what the technology is providing and what we're doing. Remote exams, we've had 2 experiences because we did remote exams last semester, but we just finished with midterms because we also give a midterm in con law, so the students have less on the line and less stress, and it's a formative assessment. So the meeting I just came out of, I said, we are not investing for COVID. We are not investing and thinking about our pedagogy and technology for COVID. We are permanently transforming how we are delivering legal education. And so I want to know that if we are spending money on technology and pedagogy and approaches to legal education, that you can tell me that this is what we should be doing in 21 and 22. It's not about next semester, it's about 21 and 22. And so the other thing I'll talk about that we all know is the impact of COVID, is that it has accelerated our adoption of technology across the board. So while we have been integrating technology, law practice technology, research technology into our skills curriculum for some time, the reality is we're on fast forward now because the world has been permanently changed. Even your most curmudgeonly judge and lawyer has adopted technology. And so we are graduating our students into a world that is different than I practiced in, obviously. But also 36 states have adopted a rule of professional responsibility that requires lawyers to be competent in technology. And I think we can give our graduates an advantage by making sure they are very competent with technology, and the partners who hire them, who haven't bothered, are dependent upon our graduates because they know more than the partners with whom they're working about fill in the blank. So whether it's our data analytics class, which we hired somebody out of the U.S. Attorney's Office who tried a lot of big data cases and has added that to our curriculum, or it's e-discovery, or it is using a trial pad when you try a case to introduce evidence. Our graduates will know how to do all of that, and I think that makes them much more hireable and much more valuable to the firms into which they're stepping. So I spend a lot of time not reading cases, but reading about AI and technology and the way the world is transforming so that we're producing graduates prepared. So I'll just give one example, and then I'll let Isa share some of your questions. So what I'm doing now is presidential candidate Biden is talking a lot about infrastructure. And I believe that irrespective of who the next president is, infrastructure is one of a top priority for the United States. Whether you're talking about sustainability, or you're talking about transportation, or you're talking about communication satellites, whatever it is, we are needing to invest dramatically in infrastructure. And so one of the things I've been doing is interviewing people to understand what infrastructure is, so that we will have a curricular pathway for students who are going into, New Jersey, New York. Our metropolitan area is a major port. And here a port includes airport, the port, the water, what we understand to be ports in colloquial language, but it's also the tunnels that connect New York and New Jersey, the Acela that connects Boston to Washington, D.C. So all of these things are infrastructure, and they all need dramatic investment, which I just learned the other day that requires bonding and insurance, and that hadn't been on my list of curricular needs for that. So that's just one example of how I approach the curriculum, is who are the clients that our students, our graduates will be representing 5 years from now, and that's informing our curriculum.
Thanks so much, Dean Buzang. And the insight and your comments really are sort of hitting home, even as I talk to some of our current students, and certainly the prospective students, I think, that a lot of our pre-law advisors are working with right now. So I'd like to open it up to questions. I've already seen a couple come through the Q&A section. Please feel free to continue to plug your questions in there, and I will funnel them through to Dean Buzang. But one of the pre-law advisors asks, as you might imagine, folks are thinking about Sorry, I lost the connection there for a bit because I stepped on the plug. Folks are thinking about education and legal education, higher ed in a different way. And so folks might be thinking about trying to complete their undergrad degree in 3 years and then go to law school. Do you think a student who would accelerate their undergrad experiences and maybe come to law school with only 3 years of undergrad would find themselves at a disadvantage or in a different space than what one might say a traditional trajectory for law school? So any insight on that?
So I'm going to say one student at a time. So I really think that's a very individual decision. And I don't think there's anything necessarily preclusive. It's maturity. So we do have 3+3 programs, and we had one student who, from Seton Hall, the story makes that clear, so who decided to continue living in her sorority house while she was a 1L. That was not successful. So we need to counsel the students really effectively and test. And as you're talking to them, we all have our ways of gently or not so gently, depending, talking to the students about, looking holistically at their lives from a maturity perspective, from a financial perspective, from a social perspective, because they are going to be missing perhaps their senior year of college, which means something specific pre-COVID to a lot of students. And then I guess it's our collaborative job to make sure that they're well educated and have the courses, the preparation to ensure that they're successful. And I mentioned that last because that's probably my least concern, because I think you can be well prepared if you have the AP courses that enable you to accelerate. You take a rigorous curriculum. I think that especially those students who observed what their families, some families went through after the 2009 crash, they're very serious. They're very goal-oriented. They're more mature in some respects. And so I do think a fair number of them are absolutely prepared. And I'm very conscious of talking to them about managing their debt and making good financial decisions. So one student at a time. It depends on the person, what their goals are, and what their maturity is.
Absolutely, that actually makes perfect sense. And you're right, we definitely have folks that come from all walks of life. So again, this is where I really appreciate our one student at a time. Rob actually has a question and he's raised his hand. So did you want to ask your question, Rob? Or did you want me to ask it on your behalf? I think you just posted it.
I saw it, but I don't think I understood it completely.
Right. Let me see. Robert, can you hear us? And can you clarify your question for Dean Buzang? You should be able to, I've unmuted you, so you should be able to share your question. If not, I'll try and decipher it if possible.
I asked the question about even if a student's not in a special program, can they apply after only 30 credits or 90 credits? And
okay, so Isa will correct me because when it gets down to the nitty-gritty of rules, she knows them better than I do. So yeah, you don't have to be in a 3+3, which I think is what you're referring to when you say a special program. Under accreditation rules, a student has to have a degree. So we need evidence of a diploma by the time classes start. So that's really the major criterion that I think is relevant to this question. Does it sound like I got it right?
You do, and I think what Robert's asking is that there is a stipulation from the ABA that says certain students can apply to law school without necessarily having completed a bachelor's, as long as they have a certain amount of credits. And I don't know off the top of my head what those credits are, but that's also going to be done on a case-by-case and school-by-school basis. At Seton Hall, because of our commitment to our accreditation, to our quality of education, we do require students to have or will have completed by they enter a bachelor's degree. There are other institutions that don't necessarily allow that, and it's going to be done on a case-by-case basis, and they outline what those policies might be for that particular institution. But for us, again, because of our commitment to our quality of education, our commitment to our outcomes, and our commitment to a student's opportunities for success, we really need the bachelor's, at least the bachelor's degree when they apply. So Dean Boozang definitely got that on the mark and on point. So Robert, I hope that answered your question. If it didn't, feel free to follow up and we can certainly clarify that for you. Dean Buzang, I did have someone else ask in the chat about, they mentioned again our health law program, your passion for health law. What does that look like for somebody who might be interested in disability law? Is that something that is part of our program? Is that something that we can offer to students at greater depth and at greater clarity?
Absolutely. So we have both a doctrinal course that Professor Jacoby teaches in disability law. He has spent his career working with government to transform regulations to make healthcare accessible to people, communities that are underserved, and disability, people who with disabilities is a huge focus of his attention and his work in the public sphere. We also have a health justice clinic that students take clinic in their 3rd or 4th year, and they do a lot of work in the disability space, very specifically, not exclusively, with veterans. So they deal with fascinating questions. So because the rules can differ between getting disability benefits as a veteran versus a non-veteran, a civilian. And for example, one of the questions that professor has been working on is if you have pain, and there's no question you're being treated for pain and it's debilitating pain, but if it's from an unknown etiology, which some number of veterans have, do you have access to benefits? And as you can imagine by the way I phrased the question, it can be very challenging. Whereas in the workers' comp or other areas, I hope I'm getting this law right, I've been to a few presentations, there's an easier pathway. So yeah, so we're addressing both worlds with respect to disability law.
Thanks so much for that, Dean Boozang. So our neighbor in New York, Joe Kenny over at St. John's, wants to know, while most students now have remote learning experience, are there any particular technological tools that they should be advising their pre-law students to learn or become familiar with to prepare them for law school? Because as you mentioned, we're thinking about it as just the future, right? Not necessarily about the response to the pandemic. And then secondly to that, with the remote learning, how has that affected the study groups, right? When people talk about study groups in law school, it can be a pretty vital part of the environment. So a two-part question: are there tools that pre-law advisors can have their students start familiarizing themselves with now? And then for our current students, how is the study group evolving, and how is the remote space allowing for that?
So I think there are tools that are AI driven that are common. They may not be the same specific tools, but they're accomplishing basically the same thing that overlap undergraduate education and legal education. If you understand what the tool is doing conceptually, it doesn't particularly matter what tool it is. So if you're interested, there's an article that was just published in the Duquesne Law Review that's called "The Ghost in the Machine: Artificial Intelligence in Law Schools." And it walks through a huge spectrum of the technologies that law schools should have already adopted or should be thinking about adopting to prepare students for practice. And there's a fair number of those tools that I have to imagine are accessible to undergraduates. I have to imagine professors won't like a lot of those tools because for lawyers, as you can imagine, AI is going to be able to draft documents or at least provide you a template if you input what you're trying to accomplish in a contract. And as a professor, I would not be happy about getting that kind of paper from a student. But that article is worth reading. And the other thing that I find personally difficult to keep up with, that I think that students should learn is all the different ways you can do research and how to find things in the internet world, and then how to discriminate among those things they're finding to determine what is a reliable resource and what is unreliable. And even understanding, for example, who is the funder for this site you have found. It's not even a fake news kind of concern, although that's part of it. You know, we all read papers where students are citing a particular resource, and I'm like, yeah, that's what some people think, and I go look at the resource and I figure out that it's a funded resource by perfectly legitimate groups, but they're right or left, and it's not presenting the whole picture. So becoming good researchers and navigating resources on the internet, and you know, I don't know whether to give up on asking them to look at books once in a while, but reading research, real research, as opposed to, and being able to critique research is really important. I mean, much of my world, whether it be, because, you know, we're working on privacy, cybersecurity, AI, which all of that intersects with health law. So a lot of what we do and what lawyers do is read non-legal materials as well. And so we have to be discerning readers of research to be able to tell what research is reliable and legitimate. And of course, who funded it, all those kinds of things. So that is the other skill set that I would suggest any graduate of law school, of college, irrespective of their career path, should be able to be proficient in, but that includes law school. And the final thing I'll say is the thing that absolutely drives me out of my mind is people who say I'm going to law school because I'm bad at math. You know, a lot of law firms are creating their own apps, they're doing their own coding, but think of an area of law that does not require math. If you're getting a divorce, you're splitting up the assets. If you're doing a partnership, you're, you know, determining how your asset, who has to put in and who's going to get what out. If you are representing an executive in an employment setting and negotiating the contract, there's a lot of tax implications. I could go on and on and on. It is very hard to think of an area of law that does not involve numbers. And not for nothing, you want to charge your client and get paid. You need to be able to run the business that is a law firm. So we need to dispel in students the perception that if you go to law school, you don't have to ever work with numbers. That's just not true. You know, I could go off on this way too long. It's not a very—
I like that insight though, Dean Boozang, about the math, because I do get that. So I really appreciate your insight on how to
not an
guide
adult view of how the world works.
And then to Joe's second part of this question about the study groups, how have you seen
Yes.
remote affect that?
Math got me off track. So you know what? The students are feeling challenged with respect to that. So ironically, and it's totally not what I expected, what we did was form a couple of remote lawyering sections for those students who are unable or choose not to attend in person, that they want to be wholly remote, which is an option. Wholly ironically, those were the students I was most worried about, but because they're in the same lawyering, which is their what we call Introduction to Lawyering is our research and writing and a whole bunch of other stuff. And those students have created this incredible bond, and they've turned themselves into a study group, and they've gotten to know each other, and they're really close with their lawyering professor, who's a full-time tenured faculty member. I just talked to her this morning. So I learned something. Those students are doing fine. The challenge in the 1L has been that the students could opt remote or in person. And we started out with enough students opting in person that in order, even in our biggest classrooms, and even adding a 1L section, we had enough students choose in person that we had to do the rotation that I know a lot of your undergraduate institutions are doing. And because we did our rotation every other week for a lot of pedagogical reasons. So the reality is we're using two or three separate seating charts. And we're trying not to do that again next semester, because it meant that the students didn't make friends as easily with the people sitting next to them. And all law schools use seating charts. We assign, I don't know how we ended up doing it. That was negotiated so many times. But we needed seating charts for contact tracing. We don't let them move around, although we haven't had to do contact tracing once yet, knock on wood. So we're going to change a few things second semester. It'll be interesting if different proportions of students elect in person and remote, we won't do the rotation because I don't want to have the three seating charts. I want to figure out how to help them get to know each other. And I've been meeting with our SBA senators this week. I've been doing a lot of meetings with students, and we're working on the social aspect of things to outdoors, small groups, suggesting to the students that they work with faculty to help them create study groups. What they're doing now, and we figured this out as a result of my meeting with the SBA senators. What they're going to do is do like questionnaires on what kind of study group they want. I want to meet while I'm doing my outline. I don't want to meet with anybody until my outline's done. I only want to meet to talk about final exams. Like match people up. It's going to be like a dating service. Match people up based on how they study. And then I suggested to them another way to diminish isolation is to meet either out in what we call the shift garden outside with their professors as a study group, or in Zoom or Teams, whatever they want to do, as a study group with the professor. Because I hear from the professors that that's going really well, that the students are not yet sufficiently comfortable with their professors to sustain a one-on-one conversation with the professor, in this context. But the meetings that are going really well with the students are when they're meeting in little groups with the professor, then somebody keeps the conversation going. So we're figuring that out as we go along. And by next semester, I think we'll have it figured out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've actually, the funny thing is I had a student stop in this morning, sort of addressing, to your point, Dean Buzang, the feedback that we're trying to gather from students to help them, to help them navigate these difficult, challenging times. And so that they say, they said, yeah, there are going to be some road bumps, but it's been really nice knowing that you're addressing it. And while maybe my class may not see it, I know that next semester we'll see some of these changes. So they really appreciate that. I want to be cognizant at the
Can I say
time.
one more thing?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Wasn't asked that I want to answer. So mental health for law students is something that, the ABA has best practices, and that we're just very conscious of: the stress, the isolation, the anxiety, all of those things. So our schedule for next semester, we have Wellness Mondays. We have 3 Wellness Mondays built in, where because we canceled spring break, which the students petitioned to resurrect for spring break. On the one hand, promised they wouldn't travel on spring break, but then said, and we should have 2 weeks remote after spring break. And I said, yeah, who lawyered this one? Because those 2 things don't go together. But what we did was we canceled spring break. We have 3 Wellness Mondays, and we have remote, no class Fridays. So we redid the faculty's teaching schedule, so that we built in 3 Wellness Mondays and no class Fridays, so that the students have a few 4-day weekends, and every weekend is a 3-day weekend if it's not 4 days. That has made everybody happy. No spring break. I did not cave on that, because I don't think it's healthy for the country for us to be giving students spring break. But we worked it out, and everybody's happy.
Yeah, and I've been part of those conversations, so I really appreciate your thought and insight on that. I want to be conscious of the time. I think we got through all the questions, but I do have one question that I'm hoping you might be able to address briefly or quickly. And that is our, at Seton Hall, we offer MSJs as well, right? We have or even certificate programs. And so I'm wondering if you might be able to offer our pre-law advisors some insight on who the MSJs might be better suited for versus a JD, or how they can help advise students towards an MSJ or a JD, or away from either one of those.
Yeah, so when a student talks about getting a JD, I ask them why. What do you imagine yourself doing? And if they don't imagine themselves practicing law, that doesn't end the conversation, because the JD in the business world is, even if you've never practiced, is a significant skill set that you bring to the table, and is also a credential that you bring to the table that, deserve it or not, brings you deference, and it enables you to work more effectively with lawyers as well. But there are some, I think, once you figure out one student at a time, figuring out finances, where they are, is this a second career? Are they trying to advance in their current career, which is the average age of our MSJs right now is 39, but given the job market for people coming out of college, or your late 20s, your early 30s, I think that the MSJ will be appealing to them. But I listen carefully, and depending upon what they want to do, it could be that the MSJ is a more appropriate degree from an ROI cost perspective. And then there is the other population whose scores, whether you're talking about your credentials, whether it be your academic record or your LSAT or your GRE, that their pathway for law school is not going to guarantee that they'll get a degree. They may attrit, or it won't guarantee bar passage. And for those students, I think that the MSJ is something they should seriously consider. I think the ROI is highly likely to be much higher for that group than spending what we charge for the JD.
Thanks so much for offering that insight. I know that in my visits with pre-law advisors, That's always a question is, you know, the ROI, the value propositions of an MSJ or MLS, I guess, depending on which law schools you're looking at. So I think any guidance that you can offer, insight in terms of how to advise is great. And you're right, it's always about a one student at a time approach. But with that said, again, I want to be conscious of the time. I know a lot of our pre-laws have a 1 o'clock meeting. You probably do too, Dean Buzang. But I just want to thank you for joining us. Thank you for sharing your insight with us.
Yeah.
For all of our pre-law advisors, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and learn a little bit more about Seton Hall, but also engage in this newness that we are all working and living with together. Please don't hesitate to reach out after today. We're happy to continue to work and partner with you as we move forward. Anything that my admissions team can do to help you and your students, will be happy to help and do. Anything that Dean Buzang and her team will also be happy to offer that as well. So don't hesitate to reach out. Again, thank you all for taking the time today. We wish you all a good afternoon and continue to wish you health and safety to you and your family. And we'll continue to be in touch and work through this together. So with that, thank you so much, Dean Buzang.
All right,
Take
bye.
care. Have a good afternoon.